I'm 31 years old and I've never told anyone the full story, not even my closest friends, partly because I'm still not sure I fully understand it myself. But I think I'm ready now. I work as a trauma surgeon at a hospital in Vancouver. I've been doing this for 4 years, which still feels surreal when I say it out loud. I went through 11 years of training, undergrad, med school, residency, fellowship, living off instant noodles and terrible coffee, sharing apartments with 3 other people, driving a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard and a passenger side window that wouldn't roll down all the way. By the time I started earning a real income, I had forgotten what it felt like to spend money freely. So I just didn't. I kept living the same way. Not because I was being strategic about it, just because I never got around to changing. My apartment in Kitsilano is small. I own it outright. Bought it with cash when the market dipped a few years ago. But it's still small. I shop at the farmer's market on Saturdays, cook most of my meals, wear the same winter coat I bought 6 years ago. It's a good coat, wool. I don't think about it. I met Colin in the most ordinary way. A mutual friend's birthday dinner at a restaurant in Gastown. He was seated across from me and we spent most of the night talking about whether the bread basket was worth the hype. It was not. We agreed it was not. He asked for my number before dessert arrived and I gave it to him. Colin was warm. That's the word I keep coming back to. Genuinely warm in a way that felt rare. He taught high school history in Burnaby. He drove a truck that smelled like coffee and had a stack of student essays on the back seat at all times. He called his grandmother every Sunday. On our third date, he helped an elderly man whose grocery bags had split on the sidewalk outside a Save-On Foods. And he didn't make a thing of it, just helped, tied up the bags, said, "Have a good night," kept walking. I noticed things like that. We dated for 8 months before he brought up meeting his family. He'd mentioned them, of course, his mother, who he clearly adored, and his stepfather, who he described as a lot, with the kind of smile that tells you the word doesn't quite cover it. He had a stepsister, Vanessa, who was 3 years younger than him and worked in commercial real estate in Calgary. She was visiting for a long weekend in October, and his mother had planned a dinner. He wanted me to be there. I said yes. I was nervous, but I said yes. I should tell you something first, though. The reason I didn't correct anything when his family got the wrong impression of me, the reason I let them believe what they believed, was not some strategic mastermind move. I want to be honest about that. It was something my grandmother said to me once, years ago, when I was maybe 16. We were watching a dinner party scene in some old movie where a woman was trying very hard to impress a room full of people who had already decided to dismiss her. My grandmother turned to me and said quietly, "Let them show you who they are before you show them who you are. Give people enough rope." I thought about that when Colin was explaining the dinner to me. Just watch, I told myself. Just watch first. I wore a simple dark green dress I'd had for a couple of years. Nice, but not flashy. I drove my Civic. I brought a bottle of wine, a good one from a small Okanagan vineyard I liked, but nothing that announced itself. I was not performing anything. I was just being myself. Colin's mother answered the door. Her name was Lorraine. She was in her early 60s, immaculate in a way that felt effortful. Silk blouse, hair set perfectly, a fragrance that arrived before she did. She hugged Colin first, and then she turned to me with a smile that was technically pleasant but didn't quite reach her eyes. She said it was lovely to meet me. She said Colin had told them so much about me. She looked at my coat, the wool one, for about half a second longer than necessary, then stepped back to let us in. The house was in South Surrey. Large open concept, the kind of place that had been renovated recently and expensively. Colin's stepfather, George, was standing near the kitchen island holding a glass of red wine. He shook my hand with the grip of a man who wanted you to know he'd thought about his grip. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, the sort of person who uses the word investment as a verb. Vanessa was on the sectional with her phone. She looked up when we came in. Gave me a quick once-over, the way people do when they've already made a decision and are just confirming it, and said, "Hey." Then went back to her phone. Dinner was set for 7. For the first hour, we sat in the living room and the conversation went in the direction most conversations go when people are feeling each other out. What neighborhood do you live in? What do you drive? Where did you grow up? I answered honestly. I said Kitsilano. I said Kitsilano. I said I drove a Civic. I said I grew up in Saskatoon, which always seems to land as a mildly disappointing answer in Vancouver rooms. I said I worked in medicine. Lorraine said, "Oh, how lovely. Are you a nurse?" I said I was in surgery. She said, "Oh, a surgical nurse. That must be so demanding." I didn't correct her. I don't know exactly why. Partly the wine, partly my grandmother's voice in my ear, partly just a kind of detached curiosity about where the evening was going. I just said yes, it can be long hours. Colin glanced at me. I gave him the smallest look that meant let it go, and to his credit, he did. George asked what hospital. I told him. He nodded in the way people nod when they're not really listening. Then he pivoted to talking about a commercial property he'd acquired in Langley, and the conversation moved on. Dinner was roast chicken and root vegetables. Lorraine had clearly cooked it carefully, and I told her so, genuinely, because it was good. She accepted the compliment with a small performance of modesty and then said she'd been thinking about taking a cooking class in Tuscany next spring. Josh said they'd been looking at a rental property there as well. Vanessa mentioned a colleague who'd bought a chalet near Whistler and was renting it out most of the year. I ate my chicken and listened. I want to be clear, nothing overt happened at dinner. Nobody said anything cruel. It was subtler than that. It was the texture of the conversation, the way they talked about things, places, purchases, as a kind of shorthand that assumed agreement. The way Lorraine asked Colin, within earshot of me, whether he thought more about looking at townhomes now that interest rates were settling. The way George mentioned that Vanessa's last bonus had been impressive. The way Vanessa said she was thinking of upgrading her car before year-end, and then looked at me with a brief, polite smile, the kind you give someone when you've remembered they're in the room. After dinner, Colin helped George with the dishes. I offered to help and Lorraine said no, go sit, you're a guest. So I sat in the living room and Vanessa poured herself another glass of wine and sat across from me. She asked, pleasantly enough, what I was planning to do with my career. But the surgical nursing had room for advancement? I said there was always room to grow. She nodded. She said it was important to have ambition, even in supporting roles. She said it nicely. She said it with complete sincerity. I looked at the painting on the wall behind her, a large abstract in blues and grays, the kind sold at upscale hotel art sales, and I breathed in through my nose. I thought about my grandmother. Then I heard them. I had gotten up to find the bathroom, and I was coming back down the hallway when I heard Lorraine and Vanessa talking in the kitchen. The dishes were done. George had gone to take a phone call. Colin was still somewhere at the back of the house. Vanessa's voice, she seems nice enough, but honestly, Mom, she's a surgical nurse in her 30s, in a Civic. Lorraine, I know. I thought she'd be more. Vanessa, he has such a type. Remember Janelle? Lorraine, don't remind me. I want him to be with someone who can meet him where he's going. The business isn't going to be small forever. Vanessa, he needs someone with standing, someone who brings something to the table other than good intentions. A pause, the sound of glasses being moved. Lorraine, she seems sweet. But sweet isn't a plan. I stood very still in the hallway. The wallpaper was grey with a thin green stripe. I counted the stripes to keep my breathing even. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what I expected. I thought I'd feel angry. I thought I'd feel small. Instead, I felt something much quieter, a kind of clarifying sadness, the way the air feels after a long rain. Not for myself, for Colin, who had no idea his mother thought about him this way, who thought this dinner was about me meeting the people he loved, who had been for 8 months exactly who he seemed to be. I walked back into the living room and sat down. When Vanessa came back in, she smiled at me warmly, and I smiled back. When Lorraine offered tea, I accepted. When George came back and asked about weekend plans, I told him Colin and I were thinking about a hike near Squamish. And he said, "Good idea. Great time of year for it." I drove home that night thinking about what I was going to do. The thing is, I wasn't angry at Lorraine for wanting more for her son. That's a human impulse. I've seen it in my own family. I was angry at the smallness of the measure. The idea that what a person brings to the table is legible from a car model or a job title. That worth is something you can read from the outside in 15 minutes. I was angry, most of all, at how certain she was, how she looked at me and thought she knew. I came home, made tea, sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the island because that's where I think best, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to blow anything up. I wasn't going to orchestrate some elaborate reveal at a family gathering. That's not who I am, and honestly, it wouldn't have been for Colin's benefit either. What I was going to do was wait for the natural moment and let the truth be exactly what it was, not weaponized, just present. That moment came about 3 weeks later. Colin's workplace was having a fundraiser for one of their teacher colleagues who'd been diagnosed with a serious illness, a community thing, a dinner at a nice restaurant downtown, and he'd asked if I would come. A few people from the school, a few partners, his mother and George had also been invited because George had donated to the school's music program a few years back and had kept up a relationship there. We arrived together. I was wearing a dress I'd borrowed from exactly nobody. I'd bought it specifically for a conference gala the previous year. Clean and well cut, nothing theatrical. I'd taken a rideshare because parking downtown was impossible, so there was no car to form an opinion about. Lorraine saw me before she saw Colin. She smiled, registered the dress, recalibrated slightly. I could see it happen in real time. She said I looked beautiful. I thanked her. We were seated at a larger table. One of Colin's colleagues, a biology teacher named Jamie, was seated near us and made conversation easily, asked about my work, the way people do at these things. I said I was a trauma surgeon. Jamie said, "Oh wow, that's intense. How long have you been doing it?" I said 4 years, residency before that, fellowship at Vancouver General. There was a brief quiet at our end of the table. Lorraine looked at me, not unkindly, more like someone who has been handed a document and is rereading a paragraph they must have misread the first time. She said, "I didn't realize. I thought you'd said, I thought Colin said, I said it never quite came up. George said, a surgeon. Trauma. He said it the way people repeat things when they're thinking through implications." Vanessa, who was seated beside her mother, said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Good for you." And it landed oddly, somewhere between genuine and automatic, and I think she knew it too. Colin reached under the table and took my hand. He squeezed it once, and I could tell from the quality of the squeeze that he was trying not to laugh, and that he would have many questions later. The dinner continued. The fundraiser raised a good amount. The colleague's family gave a short speech that made most of the table tear up. On the way out, Lorraine stopped me in the lobby while Colin was getting our coats. She said, "I think I may have misjudged you a little." I looked at her. She was being sincere, I could tell, and I wasn't angry at her anymore. I just felt tired, in the honest way you feel tired after something has been resolved. I said, "I think most people get misjudged a little at first." "It's okay," she said. "Colin is very lucky." I said, "I think we're both doing okay." I said, "I think we're both doing okay." I meant it. And I think she knew I meant something else too, that I'd heard her in that hallway, that I'd chosen not to make it a catastrophe, that the choice itself was the kind of answer. Colin and I talked in the car on the way home. I told him everything, including the hallway. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm sorry." I said, "You didn't do anything." He said, "I know, but still." His mother called me 2 days later. She invited me for coffee, just the two of us, and I went. We sat at a cafe near her house for almost 2 hours and talked. Really talked. And it turns out Lorraine had her own version of being underestimated a long time ago when she was young and trying to build something and nobody took her seriously either. She'd forgotten that somewhere along the way. Or maybe she hadn't forgotten it. Maybe she'd built a wall around it and called the wall ambition. I don't have a tidy bow to tie around this. We are still together, Colin and I. His mother and I are not best friends, but we are honest with each other now, which is worth more. Vanessa sent me a surprisingly thoughtful message a few months later after she'd gone through something at work that had rattled her. And we've talked a few times since. I think about my grandmother's advice a lot. Give people enough rope, let them show you who they are. But I've added my own amendment to it now and then decide carefully, without cruelty, what you want to do with that information. Because the point was never to humiliate anyone. The point was to know. The point was always just to know. I still think about that hallway, the grey wallpaper with the cream stripe, counting the lines to keep my breathing steady while Lorraine and Vanessa talked about what I was worth and what I wasn't. The strange thing is, nothing they said was especially cruel. I've heard far worse in hospital corridors, sharp words thrown in high-pressure moments, things people don't fully mean. What Lorraine and Vanessa said in that kitchen was quieter than cruelty. It was just certainty. The kind of certainty people carry when they've never been asked to question it. And I think that's what stayed with me. Not the words, but the ease of them. I've spent a lot of time in environments where you're measured constantly. Med school, residency, fellowship, the OR. You learn pretty quickly that the people who do well over the long run are rarely the ones who were the most impressive on the surface. They're the ones who kept going when it was hard and unglamorous and nobody was watching. The ones who asked for help when they needed it. The ones who were honest about what they didn't know. Those qualities don't photograph well. You can't read them from a coat or a car. What I did that night, staying quiet, watching, not correcting, wasn't strategy in the way people might assume. It wasn't revenge. It was just something my grandmother taught me, dressed up a little in real life. She was a woman who had been underestimated her entire career, a bookkeeper in a firm that never once considered promoting her despite the fact that she understood their finances better than anyone in the building. She didn't blow anything up on her way out. She just kept her integrity intact and let the record speak. She told me once that the most powerful thing you can do when someone misjudges you is to stay exactly who you are and give it time. Not to prove them wrong, just to let the truth be itself. I think about that every time I'm in a situation where I could make someone feel small for making assumptions. The impulse is there. I won't pretend it isn't. But what I've learned slowly is that acting from that impulse doesn't actually make you feel better. It just makes two people smaller instead of one. Lorraine and I have had coffee 3 times now. She told me about a job she'd wanted in her 30s that she didn't get because someone assumed she wasn't serious enough, wasn't polished enough, didn't fit the picture they had in their head. She lost that opportunity entirely. She was still carrying it 40 years later. And somewhere in the years between then and now, she'd built a wall out of that old wound and forgotten it was a wound at all. She thought it was just good judgment. That hit me harder than the hallway conversation did. People become the things they survived sometimes. They take the shape of an old hurt and call it wisdom. The work, the real, quiet, ongoing work, is in noticing when that's happening, in having the honesty to look at your own certainties and ask whether they actually aren't or whether they're just scar tissue you've been calling a standard. Colin still drives a truck with essays on the back seat. I still drive my Civic. We're still doing okay. And I think my grandmother would have liked that ending very much.